I'm ready for this roundtable, which is going to be very interesting. As I told you this morning, it is entitled Biology and Biotechnology in the Service, at the service of the question of man. And we have Maureen Condic, Carter Snead, Luis Miguel Pastor participating. We have as moderator Javier Galan, who's professor of UFB, and he is biochemistry, and he's also working at the degree of biomedicine. Afterwards, we have prepared a very nice award ceremony of the 4th and 5th edition awards of the extended or expanded reason awards. We hope that you will enjoy this roundtable as we have enjoyed the rest of the conference. Thank you very much. Well, first I would like to thank you for your attendance to this last roundtable and our very distinguished speakers. To start, I would like to devote a couple of minutes to put this into context, because we are going to be here for quite a while, and I also want to introduce our speakers. I want to start by saying that we live in times in which technological advances in the field of life sciences offer endless opportunities in the manipulation of life itself. Opportunities are opening up as never before in the history of mankind. Opportunities to improve the life of man and other beings in nature. Knowledge, cure of diseases, generation of resources, etc. But at the same time, they also open deep debates as never before. Debates about the very nature of the human being. What does it mean to be human? Debates about the transgenerational impact of these technologies when we speak about changes in the germline of the human being. It is necessary, it is urgent and important that advances in this area be accompanied by a profound reflection of the very nature on their moral goodness or otherwise. To help in this reflection, we have the presence of three distinguished speakers, whom I thank first of all for being here, for the effort they have made. I would like to clarify that for personal reasons, Professor Snead could not be here with us in person, but for a nice reason, he has recently become a father. But he has been able to record his participation. So once I have said this, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Carter Snead is a law professor, and he's the director of culture in the Illinois University in the US. He's one of the experts in public bioethics, governance, medicine, on behalf of ethic goods. His research studies neuroethics, the perfectioning of the species, study with human embryos, abortion, and decision-making at the end of the life. He's an author of What It Means to Be Human, The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics. Elected by the Wall Street Journal as one of the best 10 books of the year 2020, and winner of the 5th edition of the Open Reason Awards. He was a general advisor of President Bush. He was main negotiator of the US government before UNESCO for the Bioethics and Human Rights Universal Declaration. He is also a member of the Pontificia Academia for Life, which is the main advising entity in bioethics for Pope Francis. He's also a member of the Human Center, which is one of the oldest institutes in bioethics in the world. We have Maureen Condic. She's also a neurobiology a professor, the Faculty of Medicine in Utah, in the Department of Pediatrics. Her research is focused in stem cells in the development and regeneration, and it has been acknowledged internationally with the prizes Basic, O'Connor, McKnight in 2015. She was appointed member of the Pontificia Academy for Life, and in 2018 she was appointed by the President of the US for Science. Dr. Condic has published, together with her brother, who's not here with us, but he's well represented, the book Human Embryos, Human Beings, a Scientific and Philosophical Approach, written with his brother Samuel, as I was telling you, that has made her be awarded the 4th edition of the Open Reason Award. We also have Luis Miguel Pastor Garcia, who's a professor of cellular biology in the medical faculty of University of Murcia. He is a president of the Spanish Association of Bioethics and Medical Ethics, and member of the Sociedad Doctors in Murcia. Once I have made this introduction, we're going to start with the roundtable. Yesterday, we had the opportunity to listen to an introduction to the book of Maureen Condic, but as I say, unfortunately, Professor Snead is not here, so we cannot listen to a similar presentation. So I would like to start with a very brief introduction of this book of Professor Snead that he himself explained, and which has been recorded. So I'm going to ask the technicians to put on the screen the video number 1.
Have this conversation with you today. I'm sorry that I'm not able to join everyone in person for this wonderful award ceremony, to meet my colleagues who have also been honored, and the wonderful people associated with the Expanded Reason Awards. So I'm grateful, but I'm also sorry that I'm not able to join you. My book, What It Means to Be Human, The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics, is an exploration of important questions at the intersection of law, science, public policy, philosophy, and anthropology. And there are essentially 2 claims made in the book. The first is a methodological claim. The claim is that the richest way to understand questions of public bioethics, which I define as the governance of science, medicine, and biotechnology, that is the point at which the law and public policy come into contact with these ethical questions that arise from advances in biomedical science and biotechnology, that the richest way into understanding these issues is through the lens of what I describe as an inductive anthropological inquiry, meaning you ask the question, what vision of the human person and human flourishing is at the core of these areas of law, public policy, and bioethics? And you might ask, well, why do I think that's a useful way into these questions? And why is the question of anthropology, the question of what it means to be human, why is that relevant to issues of policy and law relating to bioethics? And the answer is fairly straightforward. The answer is that all law aims to promote the flourishing of persons and to provide for the protection of persons. That at bottom is what law is. Law is meant to serve persons. And therefore, all law, no matter what law it is, but especially the law relating to bioethics, has to operate from a prior understanding of what a person is and what human flourishing is. Otherwise, there'd be no way to measure the success of the law, to understand the relationship between means and ends. You have to. There's no avoiding the problem of taking on assumptions about what it means to be and flourish as a human being if you're going to reason about law, if you're going to make law, if you're going to interpret law. So being that being the case, it seems to me important for us to drill down into the normative structure of the law and ask the question of what are the assumptions that the law applies in terms of what persons are and what their flourishing consists in. And it's especially true in the area of public bioethics, which is concerned with fundamental aspects of human life, deeply contested matters involving assisted reproduction and abortion and end-of-life decision-making, research involving human subjects, issues of vulnerability, issues of patients seeking care from physicians, seeking to be involved in their own decision making. Basically, the issue of public bioethics is about human vulnerability. It's about what it means to be a human being. And so my argument, my methodological argument, is to understand the law most deeply and richly, you have to answer the question of what does the law assume a person to be and what his or her flourishing consists in. That's the methodological claim. The substantive claim of the book emerges from applying that analysis to what I describe as the vital conflicts of American public bioethics, the legal and policy disputes over abortion, which, as you all know, is very, very significant at this moment in my own country, the issues of assisted reproduction, and the issues of end-of-life decision-making. I asked the question, what and who does the law assume a person to be in those particular areas as it builds legal structures, protections, incentives, deterrents, and so on in the law? And what I found when I asked that question was that the vision of the person, human flourishing, that animates these areas. And by the way, it's not limited to American law and policy. My own experiences at the UN and the Council of Europe reveals that this anthropology also infuses the discussions in Europe and all around the world. It's a vision of the person that very closely tracks what philosopher Charles Taylor and social scientist Robert Bellah has described as expressive individualism. And it's a vision of the person that defines the human being as coextensive with his or her will or his or her mind. What makes you, you, and me is our capacity to interrogate the depths of our own sentiment, discover our own original, authentic truths, to express them, and then to configure our life plan accordingly. And human flourishing is defined in this framework of expressive individualism as the construction and pursuit of the projects of the will. Everything else about human experience, our relationships, our traditions, the communities in which we live, even our own bodies themselves, are purely instrumental towards that goal of pursuing our own individual, authentic, original, true destinies as we devise them. And what I argue in the book is that is a very incomplete view of the human person, and it leads to laws that don't provide for all of the needs and to protect human beings from all of the risks that are present in these particular areas. I argue that it is certainly true that we are free. It is true that we are individuated in some important way, but the truths of expressive individualism stop there. They don't extend to the full panoply of reality of what it means to be a human being. Central to that identity, I argue in the book, is the fact that we are embodied. We are bodies, fragile, corruptible bodies in time. And that has very concrete entailments for who we are and what we owe to each other. And the anthropology of expressive individualism can't make sense of that, and therefore can't make sense of our vulnerability. It can't make sense of our mutual dependence upon one another. It can't make sense of our subjection to natural limits. And it can't even recognize the needs and, in fact, our obligations to vulnerable others, including especially children, the elderly, and the disabled.
Muchas gracias, Professor Snead.
After this introduction of Professor Snead's work, I think we can cut to the chase of the different topics that we are going to discuss this afternoon. And for this, I would like to start focusing on two of these advances. The first one, gene editing using the CRISPR-Cas9 tool. As you know, it is a new gene engineering tool that allows to modify the genes of a series of species, including that of the human being. With this, we can correct gene alterations that can be responsible for many diseases, serious diseases, both in human adults and embryos. Could you please, Professor Condic, tell us something about the current status of this technology, its opportunities and limitations as a first step to understand where the different controversies may come from?
So this particular mechanism for modifying genes is not entirely new. We have had for many years ways of altering the genome or particular genes in living creatures. What is new about CRISPR is that a mechanism that allows scientists to alter multiple genes at the same time with very little work and with much greater accuracy than has been possible in the past. So I think much of the concern or alarm about this particular technique first reflects its power. I think we were all as a society very comfortable letting scientists alter genes when it took them many years to do it, and they could only do it in plants or in mice, but not so easily in humans. And now it is much easier and faster to change things. And this has created significant concern because one of the first applications of this technique in human cells was to bypass human cells entirely and go straight to human embryos. When you use a human embryo as a subject for research, that creates concerns immediately because you are destroying human beings as part of an experimental approach. But moreover, changing genes in an embryo is changing genes in an entire being, is not just changing genes in a cell, but it's altering the actual genetic composition of a person. And this has created a great deal of alarm, even among scientists who don't particularly believe that embryos are persons and have rights. It has created alarm simply because it is a germline change. So it is a change that would be inherited by any children that that individual might have if they're allowed to mature. And that could potentially change the entire species. So I think the concerns over CRISPR have been a reflection of the power of this technique, the rapidity of the technique, the fact that we can do experiments that would normally take many years over a period of weeks, and the fact that it has been almost immediately applied to human embryos.
With respect to what Professor Condic was just talking about, in November 2018, the news was published that the researcher from China, He Jiankui, had precisely carried out an experiment to modify the genes in human embryos. He announced the birth a few weeks before October 2018 of two babies, just known as Lulu and Nana, two babies modified genetically by using this technology of CRISPR-Cas9 in order to introduce a deletion and elimination of 32 base pairs in gene CCR5. It is a gene that codifies for a protein that can be used as an entry port for the HIV virus when it comes to infecting lymphocyte cell T. The premise was that with this gene mutation, these two babies would in principle be immune to the infection by HVI virus. In that sense, Professor Pastor, I'd like to ask you, where are we heading with this technology? Where are we heading in this specific matter? In your view, will we be able to assume the genetic modification of embryos by using these technologies? If so, under what premises? And what's more, will it be licit to use CRISPR-Cas9 in any case, in any finality or level of intervention? First, thank you for inviting me to be here in this panel. A very interesting panel, by the way. I'd like to insist on something that the previous speaker mentioned. I find it very interesting to talk about anthropological vision, but it is very important also to consider that biopolitics, or whatever we're going to call it, biolegal science, we need to discern what's the common good, because there's different type of approaches, and we need to really look for the anthropology, yes, but that leads us to consider also what is the common good for the entire society. With respect to what you're asking or suggesting, the first thing I'd like to propose is how positive this technique is. Obviously, there's a part which is huge. It generates fear and very fine-tuned surgery, as the previous speaker, Dr. Condic, mentioned. But we need to see the possibilities also. We need to be very positive with science always, and in an open reason approach, we need to see that this is one of the most important creations of our reason, instrumental reason also, although, as we well know, we need to combine it with others. The second issue that comes to my mind is that identity is the limit. We cannot intervene and modify the identity that defines us as human beings. Well, there, the thing is, actually, when we discussed that long time ago, cloning, many of us defended and said that after all it was a non-therapeutic alteration of the human genome, because what we were doing it was that we were designing the cloning according to our desires. And in that sense, the discussion of this technique is the same as the one that we've been talking about for a long time, and it explains it brings out a very important question, which is distinguishing between what is therapeutic and what is not. This has to do with the philosophical point of view of the fact that we have dedicated ourselves to drafting a discourse, so to say, or a reasoning about the importance of diversity, the importance of differences in human person's aspects. But I believe that now this places us in front of a clear debate in order to divide what is pathological. Because there's certain currents that have been stating that the medical paradigm had somehow invaded everything related to diseases, illnesses, mental disabilities also. Actually, a lot of people talk about functional diversity, right? Well, we need to acknowledge that this is not that medicine is playing to impose a paradigm of what is normal, so to say, but rather it aims to solving therapeutically and reconstructing the original wellness or goodness as much as possible of human being. And that's one of the questions that we need to discuss, because there's many possibilities. I remember that many years ago, there was a congress when I said that if I could eliminate the Down syndrome, I would eliminate it. That did not mean, obviously, that I was against people with Down syndrome. They have all the rights, and they're obviously human persons. That's clear, no argument there. But if we could eradicate that, if we had the possibility, we will need to do it. But obviously, we will need to do it by always respecting the dignity of persons. That is important, I believe, to take into consideration also. Thank you very much. Another recent advancement that has also come accompanied by a controversy has been the generation of the first chimeras, interspecies chimeras, more specifically chimeras that are sometimes known as hybrid of a pig and a human person in 2017.
Yeah, sorry. Of course, whenever you want, you can interrupt to each other. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something too.
Yeah.
I thought a very insightful comments of Dr. Pasteur that we don't yet have a very clear picture of how the application of CRISPR will actually impact the health of individuals. So it's very tempting for us in our scientific and medical hubris to think, oh, well, this is just medicine. It's an advance in medicine. But, and clearly some applications of CRISPR could be purely medical. If we had a way to eliminate hemophilia or sickle cell anemia by changing a gene that has been mutated back to a natural state using CRISPR, this would be a therapeutic application. However, many of the applications that we think could be therapeutic are perhaps not as therapeutic as they might seem. And there's an awful lot of gray that reflects our ignorance of how genes actually function. So for example, after after these 2 babies were manipulated by changing a particular gene that is known to be involved in susceptibility to HIV infection. And HIV infection is very rampant in China. The parents of these babies wanted their children to have some medical advantage. And yet, less than 12 months after the children were born, a study in Nature Medicine in 2019 that investigated living individuals who have this same mutation, the mutation that was introduced intentionally into these embryos. And to quote from that study, they said, we used genotyping and death registry information of 409,693 individuals of British ancestry to investigate the fitness of this particular mutation, the mutation that was introduced into the children. We estimated a 21% increase in all-cause mortality rate for individuals who, like the children, were homozygous for this change. So this experiment that was intended to increase the health and longevity of these children actually increased their likelihood of death by 21%. It wasn't what was intended, but it's a reflection of the fact that we don't really know what we're doing. And to immediately spring to experimentation on human beings is completely unethical. Because there are many, many types of mutations, many types of genetic changes that we know from work on animals have unanticipated negative effects. Moreover, there are many, many questions that have been raised about CRISPR with respect to its accuracy. So in 2020, also published in Nature, 3 independent studies from 3 very highly respected laboratories showed that there are widespread off-target or unintended changes introduced into the genome that affect between 22 and 50% of all the animals that are manipulated. So you intend to change one particular gene, but you actually introduce unexpected alterations in anywhere up to half of the individuals that are subjected to these manipulations. So I think there's an awful lot we don't know about this, and I think it has been unfortunate, and I would say immoral, that we have applied a very poorly understood technique to genes with very poorly understood consequences so rapidly in humans.
Por supuesto, por supuesto.
May I? Oh, yes, of course. Yes, yes. Oh, well, yes, obviously, what you, Dr. Condic, are explaining affects the caution, prudence principle that is based on a basic principle, which is the therapeutic principle. We cannot carry out actions that theoretically are therapeutic. We are going to produce more damage. And related to that, maybe we have to think about the issue of scientific evidence and the way science is achieved. And then, for instance, I have a book which is entitled I believe something like a scientific advancement or medical imprudence about the injection of intracytoplasmatic of spermatozoids. This was a technique that they used just to try to use with the needle. It started to work and then they said, okay, let's do this. That is not science, nor from the methodological point of view, nor from the ethical point of view. And I believe that that issue involves many social considerations, but also the scientists have to be regulated. They shouldn't be so vain that they wanted to be the first always. It has to do with biopolitics, with bioeconomy, and with many other things, but we have to get used, and I hope that we get used to giving steps when we have scientific evidence which is sufficiently big so as to be able to discern and maybe even act with a prudence which is based obviously on data. And also that will make us see more clearly whether it is therapeutic or not, or whether it is just something that is going to help us improve, or whether that is going to cause inequalities amongst people, because it's not just a matter of re-establishing health but other types of things. Obviously, ethics in this case is the frontispiece of the ethics. Is quite clear what we intend, but the issue is how we scientists self-regulate ourselves, and also it has to do with the evidence of data. And we would have to do a research which is much more regulated, let's say.
I would very much agree, and I'm very grateful that you have brought up the example of intracytoplasmic sperm injection, because this is a technique that has been used very widely across the entire world for many, many years now. And we are only now able to examine the product, the children, who are now adults. And we have found increasingly that these children have many significant health problems that arise only in adulthood. So how did this happen? Was it because we did not have enough data? Or is the data only to be generated by experimentation on humans? I would argue that we actually had plenty of data. We've done intracytoplasmic sperm injection quite frequently in animals, and we knew from mice that have a much shorter lifespan that these mice were not normal as adults. So what made this happen? It wasn't the absence of data. It was money and true sympathy for couples that desperately wanted children. So the physicians were driven by making a tremendous amount of money from these procedures, and society supported it because we didn't want to say no to someone who wanted a child. How could we say no to that and call ourselves pro-life? And as a result, we now have many hundreds of thousands of individuals who have been intentionally produced by a procedure that has significantly impacted their health as adults. So these are tough questions. And I think unless we are willing to face the reality of having to tell parents no, not until we know better, we will continue to experiment on human beings.
Cerraría la cuestión simplemente diciendo que no podemos trabajar a posteriori, ¿no?
We cannot just work afterwards. In the case of intracytoplasmatic injection, we have produced afterwards research with everything that we've done with human beings previously, and we are saying that that goes against the good research. And that reminds us to some of the times of the history of medicine where politics and other economic factors led supposed researchers to be involved in dishonest practices. And all of this involvement, so all of your participations I found very interesting, and allow me to please act as advocates, Devil, in order to give you a counter-argument and to ask your opinion. Because someone might say that precisely then what we are missing is more experiments with human embryos in order to be able to fine-tune the technique. What could be said about that?
I think what can honestly be said about that is the entire enterprise of biological research is predicated on the notion that what we learn from animals does, in many cases, in most cases, with subtle variations, apply to humans. And my objection to that argument is we do need more experimentation on animals, and we need to be honest about what those experiments are telling us. So I know we are going somewhat off topic here, but in the laboratory we have for many, many decades produced rodents, mice and rats from in vitro fertilization, which is something we are all familiar with. Most of us know people, couples, who have had children produced in this way. And yet we knew back when Louise Braun was first produced in the laboratory that this will produce animals that in many, many cases have serious medical problems. It had been very well established. And yet, it wasn't a lack of experimental evidence, it wasn't a lack of experimental knowledge that allowed this procedure to be applied to humans. It was that the combination of economic benefit and extraordinary compassion for the legitimate desire of parents, of couples to become parents, made us close our eyes.
Yo a eso le sumaría simplemente la vulnerabilidad del embrión humano cuando es constituido en un ambiente in vitro. Personalmente hablando, aunque estoy a favor de lo que sería la terapia en los embriones, siempre y cuando se superaran toda una serie de problemas, lógicamente, que existen, lo que no concibo es el que podamos generar un ser humano en un contexto que no es el adecuado a su dignidad y que además le somete después a todo tipo de cosificaciones, de tal manera que se convierta además en lo más vulnerable, porque de facto he trabajado en fecundación in vitro en animales y te crees realmente que tú eres el propietario, ¿no?, de aquello que estás construyendo, que estás haciendo en el laboratorio, porque pones todas las condiciones, el medio de cultivo, el oxígeno, el CO2, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces ese no es la vía que hay. De hecho hay un problema bioético claro que tenemos antiguo todos en la cabeza, que es que muchas leyes actuales que a lo mejor están aceptando una serie de cosas prohíben, por ejemplo, la obtención de embriones humanos que están en la trompa uterina de las mujeres. Claro, eso en veterinaria se puede hacer, se puede sacar, se pueden cultivar y hasta seguro se puede volver a poner, ¿no?, en los animales. Bueno, en un futuro previsible y siempre que hubiera realmente unas razones proporcionales y una cierta seguridad, etcétera, etcétera, hasta podríamos curar esos embriones, que sería una cosa positiva. Pero claro, estoy hablando en unos términos absolutamente teoréticos. Bueno, no sé si se me ha entendido. Vale.
I am sorry, I was in the Spanish channel. Why didn't you say something? I'm so sorry. You should have told me that I was in the wrong channel. I was in the Spanish channel. I'm so sorry.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so maybe I shall try to speak in English. Okay, is it okay for the audience? It seems that translation for...
No, it was... Tell him that it was just the wrong channel.
Yes.
Okay, it's fixed.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Está todo bien, está todo... Bueno, sigo. Ok, pues muchas gracias porque ha sido una cuestión muy...
Thank you very much, because it has been a very interesting presentation or answer. Anyway, a few seconds ago, I was talking about something which was very interesting, something that has generated a lot of controversy. You were saying a few minutes ago that it was the generation for the first time in history of chimeras, interspecies chimeras, specifically including human cells, specifically pig human chimeras in 2017 and macaco human chimeras in 2019. For those of you who don't know that the generation of chimeric organisms in the context of molecular biology would consist, for instance, on taking a pig embryo in a certain stage of the development, blastocyst, and micro-inject human cells that would be integrated in such an embryo and that would contribute to develop such an embryo. Or, for instance, an embryo equally in a blastocyst stage from a macaco, where we inject those human cells. In that respect, I'd like to ask you, Professor Condic, please, if you could tell us about your opinion about these experiments. Which are the bioethical challenges that we're facing?
So I want to emphasize that production of chimeric animals, so animals that contain cells of one species and cells of another species, is a very valuable and useful scientific technique. And it is actually a pretty old one. The first time we created chimeric embryos that survived to adulthood was back in 1984, when people produced live-born animals that were 50% goat cells and 50% sheep cells. So they called these creatures geeps because they were half sheep and half goat. So why do scientists want to make chimeras? What is the scientific reason for producing something that seems so artificial and exotic? But there are a number of important reasons to produce a chimera. First, if you introduce cells with altered or modified genes into a normal embryo. So if I am working on a mouse and I alter a mouse gene and then put cells with that altered gene back into a mouse, I have a very, very helpful and powerful way of testing the function of the gene in a normal developing animal. So unlike a diseased animal, where all of the cells within the animal might carry that same genetic alteration, here I can study just particular cells. What do they do if they contribute to, say, heart development? And the rest of the animal has normal gene function. So this is a very useful and powerful thing to reveal how genes actually work in a more complicated environment of an embryo. Similarly, if you introduce human cells into an animal, under some circumstances, scientists will argue that it allows you to study the normal development of human structures in much greater detail than is possible in humans, because you can take a host animal and kill that animal, and then examine the human tissue that's developing and understand more about the function of a gene or the function of cells that contribute to a particular structure without having to kill a whole human in order to make that happen. Similarly, if you introduce cells with human disease genes, just like you can study the normal function of a disease, of a gene in a chimeric animal, you can also study what a disease gene does to the natural processes of development. So for all of these reasons, I would hate to see a general ban on the approach. I think the approach is a powerful and valid scientific approach. However, in most cases, when you mix human cells with an animal embryo, you create an entity whose ontological status cannot be determined. So you are producing a living being, and you don't know what it is. And I think that, in of itself, is enough of a reason to simply say we should not do this. In the United States, we have rules for hunters. I don't know if hunting is big in Spain, but it is very big in Utah, where I come from. People like to hunt for geese and ducks and deer. And we have a rule, a law, that says if you are a hunter and you hear a noise, if you cannot know what you're shooting at, you cannot shoot, because you may kill another hunter. And I think the same kind of idea applies here. If you don't know what you are making, you should not be allowed to make it, and particularly to kill it. So, in addition to this concern, I think there are at least two experimental situations that create particular concern. The first would be to make a living animal that contains human sperm and eggs. So creating animals that have the capacity for human reproduction is very troubling, even if those animals are not allowed to reproduce. First off, accidents do happen. And in this case, you would get a fully normal human embryo developing inside of a mouse or a monkey. But even if the animals are not allowed to reproduce, this kind of a chimera would cause me concern, because human germ cells merit special respect due to their role in human reproduction and should not be incorporated into the reproductive systems of animals. A second kind of chimera that creates concern for me are animals that have a significant contribution of human cells to the nervous system. So we have made these kinds of animals, again, largely in mice, because human brains grow much larger in size during embryonic development. If you introduce human primitive nervous system cells into a mouse, they will very quickly dominate the development of the nervous system of the mouse. So you will end up with a mouse that has very large contribution of human cells to its nervous system. And when you do that, and subsequently test those mice for intelligence, for behavior and learning, the mice are strikingly smarter than normal mice. So it isn't simply that they have a lot of human cells in their brains, but the presence of those human cells significantly alters their behavior. And I personally find that very disturbing. So I think chimeras overall are a powerful technique and a useful one scientifically. But I think in general, because the ontological status, the nature of the entity you are producing cannot be determined, and because of these two special cases, the incorporation of human cells into the reproductive system and the incorporation of human cells into the brain, create particularly disturbing ethical and philosophical conundrums for research. I think overall we should not produce such animals.
Professor Pastor, preguntándole
Professor Pastor, asking your opinion about this, but also adding the data that in Japan back in 2017, the legislation was modified in order to allow these interspecies chimeras with a human component could be transferred to animal uterus and allow the development until there were these living animals were born. What do you think about this? Well, I believe biology lacks the necessary knowledge about the development, which I believe is also important, about the cell difference and all the different tissues and different organs. It is happening, as in many other situations, that technology allows us to go even beyond our own knowledge. We have knowledge that allows us to do certain things, but at the end of the day, what we are doing is like working like with the plasticity that biology allows and see what happens. So I don't think this is neither scientific nor ethical, and I would like to mention that the two things that Dr. Condic has mentioned are clearly two consequences which we clearly do not want, and that affect the nucleus, because we're not talking about a DNA which is mixed. We're talking about cells, but when these cells become an important component and we don't have any criterion to know when the vital unity is bigger than the parties, but when you change the different parties, you have a different whole, then we need to be cautious. It is clearly necessary to be cautious. And I'm not saying that genome is not the human identity in the sense, but rather cytoplasmatic nucleus, that is the nucleus of our own identity. As such, we should preserve it and all its expression and development. Nonetheless, at the same time, I'm not being critical, but at the same time, human cells are neither human embryos nor are they human beings. They're only cells. So they should make us be very careful when using them because of the consequences this may entail. The doctor has spoken about the know-how and the possible consequences of putting these cells in certain places, the gonads and the central nervous system and the development. But an important thing are transplant organs. So in all this discourse, in all to see the cells to generate a new organ, we do not yet know. So it would be very reckless to start doing things that can go to the consequences that Dr. Condic was referring to. And there's another line, which is that, as I told you before, with tissue engineering, bioimpression, we will be able to tackle with other stem cells, we will be able to reconstruct much better organs, and we will do it in a better way. I'm a histologist and not generate it in an animal to transfer it afterwards to the human being with all the infection problems that might be entailed and other things, other problems. And it is important to me when we research, we have heard so many times that you can do what you can do, but what is that you shouldn't do? Well, there are many things that you can do that you can find as many good means as in other cases, but do not entail any doubts and which are licit in themselves.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Dr. Pasteur makes some very important points, and I think his comments really orient us to a very deep philosophical problem, which is the problem of when is something a part and when is something a whole. He mentions organ transplant. So we have for a long time been able to put organs from another species into a human, and it doesn't change the human into 99% human and 1% something else, right? They are still human. And yet, with chimeras, we actually have the possibility to take something out of the realm of pure intellectual thought experiment in philosophy and turn it into a real experiment. If there are 2 trillion cells in a human and you put 1 mouse cell in, it's probably still a human. 100? 1 million? 1 billion? When does it stop? Because if you start from the other end with a mouse and do the same experiment, it's still a mouse with 1 human cell. But at some point, you create an entity whose nature you cannot know. And that in of itself is something that should give us a serious moral and ethical reserve.
Muchas gracias a los dos. Pasando a otra cuestión.
Well, going to another question, and In this way, going back to Professor Snead, it is actually a great opportunity that we have been able to have him with us, even if remotely, because in the past weeks the US Supreme Court has been in the news because of the leak of a draft of a possible ruling that might change the panorama regarding abortion. Actually, they are reviewing the 1973 ruling, Roe versus Wade, that established the constitutional coverage of abortion from then up to date, the past 50 years. Obviously, in these gaps in between corrections and test reviews, we have heard the media noise, even to the extent that it was said that the Supreme Court is going to make illegal abortion in the country. But what is it true about all this? We would like to listen to Professor Snead explain this.
Pressing question at the moment, because it seems to be the case that the Supreme Court of the United States is poised to reverse Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Now, your listeners, your audience may be well familiar with those cases, but let me just very briefly say that in 1973, the Supreme Court of the United States claimed to interpret the U.S. Constitution, a clause of the U.S. Constitution that said simply, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It's the 14th Amendment due process clause of our Constitution, which was ratified in 1868 after the Civil War, the American Civil War, where we were trying to restore and repair the terrible damage that we had done as a nation through the institution of slavery. We fought a war, we abolished slavery, we adopted amendments to our Constitution abolishing slavery, and then trying to provide for the equal protection of the laws and fair and good and just process for all people in the United States to try to heal the wound that we'd inflicted on ourselves through embracing the wicked institution of slavery. But at the time in 1868, when this language was passed, abortion was illegal everywhere in the United States. It was illegal as a common law matter. It was illegal as a matter of statute in the United States. No one in America thought that by adopting the 14th Amendment due process clause, they were preventing the states from regulating abortion or from prescribing abortion. No one thought that was true until towards the end of the 20th century. And in the court in Roe v. Wade claimed, this language, this due process clause must include a right to abortion, because otherwise our regime will be so unjust and unfair for women who experience an unplanned and unwanted pregnancy that we have to read this into the Constitution. It was an extraordinary act and a very controversial act of judicial usurpation of authority that normally is left to the political branches of government. Usually, and this is true in Europe, in every country in Europe, people are allowed to govern themselves on the question of abortion. People come together in the political spheres of government. They debate the question, they adopt laws, and the laws are different. Some countries in Europe ban abortion after 12 weeks. Some do it after 10 weeks. Some do it before that. Some do it at 22 weeks. It varies, right? But it's the process of a deliberative process. But in 1973, the United States Supreme Court took away that question from the American people and basically simply declared that there was a fundamental right to abortion effectively through 9 months of pregnancy. Now, it would take some time to explain exactly how that works. There's no need to do that now. But as you know, it was a deeply controversial thing, especially since it had a very tenuous connection to the Constitution itself. The holding of the court was not consistent with the text of the Constitution. It was not consistent with the traditions surrounding the Constitution. It was not consistent with the history of American law, especially the law connected to the Constitution. So it was a surprising development in the court, and it caused controversy in the United States for 50 years. In my book, I talk about this issue, and I try to show, and this gets to your question, how is it that the concept of expressive individualism gives rise to the law of abortion in America and Roe v. Wade? And the answer is because the right to abortion doesn't come from the text of the Constitution or its history or tradition, the right emerged from the really philosophical reflections of Justice Blackmun, who was the justice on the court that wrote the opinion, by framing the question of human abortion as a conflict between two strangers, between two atomized individual strangers, a woman who's suffering from a pregnancy that she believes is threatening to her future and is threatening to her own vision of what her future should be, on the one hand, and then a stranger, something less than a person. The court sort of declares the unborn child to be something less than a person, who is invading that woman's body and is threatening her future. And by framing the question in this way, you see immediately the hallmarks of expressive individualism. You see the account of the human being as an atomized individual, not defined in any sense by virtue of one's relationships to each other, by virtue of your embeddedness. But of course, in human pregnancy, there's already an embedded relationship between mother and child. It's not two strangers fighting over scarce resources. It is a mother and her offspring in this unique, distinctive, sort of integrated relationship whose future and lives are deeply intertwined with one another. So think for a moment, if I were to describe a scenario to you in a legal judicial opinion saying, here's the situation. We have two strangers fighting over scarce resources that properly belong to the first person. Well, what's the solution to that? The solution to that is to invent a right to use violence to repel the intruder to protect your own prerogatives. Okay. And that's precisely what the court gave us in Roe v. Wade. But the framing of the human context of abortion, I argue in the book, is not two isolated strangers fighting over scarce resources. It's a crisis involving a mother and a child. And if I describe to you a circumstance in which a mother and a child are in crisis, we don't license one party to use violence against the other. Instead, what we do is we rush to the aid of mother and child and to provide them with as much help and care and protection and support as we can. And so that is, but that's not the direction the court went. The court sort of created a narrative of conflict between two atomized strangers and then licensed the mother to use violence against her own child to repel that intrusion into her body and into her future. And so you can see that the paradigms of expressive individualism are very much driving the reasoning of the court in Roe v. Wade. Now, what the court is about to do, it seems, is to reverse Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the two judicial decisions that define abortion law in America, and return the question of abortion law and policy to the people of the United States to resolve through their own political process at each individual state level. And we will see different things emerge from that process. Some states will promote abortion. We've already seen that. New York, Illinois, California have already taken steps to promote abortion. Other states will take steps to restrict or perhaps even ban abortion. But the virtue, and a lot of the media, and perhaps I've seen this also in the media, in the European media and in the scientific media, the false suggestion that overturning Roe and Casey means that abortion will be criminalized immediately in the United States. And much of the reaction has been, how can you criminalize it? In fact, the abortion regulation in Europe is so much more restrictive than the abortion regulation in the United States. What will likely happen is we'll see in the United States something closer to the European experience, with different states pursuing different approaches, different standards, different models of governance. But what that will do by returning the matter to the political branches, it will open up the possibility of a real conversation that we haven't been able to have for the past 50 years to persuade each other, friends and neighbors, to persuade each other that what we're dealing with here is not a narrative of conflict between strangers, but rather a unique, often tragic crisis involving a mother and a child. And therefore, what we're called to do is not license one to use violence against the other and walk away and to abandon them in their strife, but rather to come to their aid and to provide care for mothers and children, born and unborn, not just during pregnancy, but throughout that child's life, to create networks, as I said earlier, of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving that provide what mothers need, what children need, what families need, and what communities need.
Yeah. Okay. Professor Condic.
Professor Condic, the editorial of Nature, approximately 2 weeks ago, said, and I quoted, and not only that, in a Tribune article that was published in different media in Spain, Margaret Atwood, well known for being the author of The Handmaid's Tale, compared the situation with what she describes in her novel. Among other statements, she says that the more strict limit of abortion activists is placed in the moment of conception, when a group of cells become a soul. But an opinion of this kind is based on a religious belief. So my question is not this just relationist? Where do we have the epistemological and methodological part of the cell?
I think there are very strong feelings on both sides of the question of abortion. And I think in part that's because abortion uniquely places two of our most deeply held values in opposition to each other. What makes us most godlike, most created in the image and likeness of God, is our freedom, our ability to choose. And yet, life is essential to our very existence. Without life, we can't be the kind of thing that we are. And so we have these two things that are of intense value and very closely entwined with each other and very intimate to our sense of who we are, that make this a passionate subject for many people, for all people. I have never met someone who doesn't have a strong opinion about abortion, one way or the other. I do want to emphasize, particularly here in Spain, how something that Carter Snead also mentioned, how radical and extreme American current law is. We are one of only 7 countries in the world, including China and North Korea, that allow elective abortion at any time through the entire 9 months of pregnancy. No country in Europe does this. 49 out of 50 members of the EU restrict abortion before 15 weeks. So American law is not simply European law, but perhaps with an American flavor. American law is like North Korean law. It is radical and atypical, and it does not make any attempt to balance the interests of the infant against the interests of the mother. So, because it is a passionate topic, and because we in America have struggled for 50 years of a truly repressive and radical set of legislation, people defend it in radical terms. As you mentioned, they will liken it to slavery. They will liken any restriction of abortion to futuristic and horrible scenarios, fictional scenarios. And yet, missing from all of this is the science. Missing from all of this is what human embryology actually tells us about human development, and when a developing embryo is a human being. And I think one of the topics that I address in my book with my brother, and also in other works that I've written, is the science of human development and why this is not subject to opinion. Now, I would personally defend anyone's right to hold an ignorant and uninformed position, because I believe in freedom. But I would not defend an ignorant and uninformed position being the basis for legislation that controls the behavior of other people and that tolerates the destruction of some people. I would like legislation on this topic to be informed by the science, and I think the science is inarguably clear that human beings come into existence at the instant of sperm egg fusion, and there is no other way of looking at it that is consistent with the facts.
Thank you. Profesor Pastor, además de preguntarle su opinión.
Professor Pastor, apart from your opinion in these regards, I would like you to add if you believe that this possible change in legislation in a country like the US could, in a way, be like the starting of a trend in other Western countries. Well, the first question is that, as Mr. Snead has said, the legislation regarding abortion appeared during the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment has not Judeo-Christian roots, but when it was coded, it was maintained during the 19th century, and then during the 60s, maybe in the Marxist world, this had appeared before. I'm saying this because of the small curtain that some people tend to put dealing with these topics to take people away from debates. Beliefs are non-beliefs are in one way or other, but we have to be working with reasons, and we have to convince each other and then go to a different political realm, to the parliament, to debate the issue. So I think this should be taken away from the religious opinion. Secondly, I believe that an individual of the human species is a human being, but we can also consider an individual of the human species which is a human being who is not, but as Dr. Condic said before, if there is any doubt, we're not going to destroy it. Sometimes I have had people in front of me who were telling me, I'm fully convinced of this, you're convinced of the opposite, but I cannot convince you. Well, at least let's plant the doubt. But we cannot hurt this other human being. So I think that abortion, from the scientific point of view, it is not that science allows you to conclude, but it gives you the possibility of applying the ethical argument of not killing the innocent. In this case, the innocent is the embryo or the fetus, be it more than 8 weeks embryo, or if the nervous system is not yet developed, or we're in the 9th month. It is a violent action, and thus it is deplorable. So, abortion debate in Europe has been normally linked to two questions. One, classical, the exception. That has generated all sorts of legislations, the depenalization of abortion. I'm not going to go into that debate, but what it is true is that in the past years we have been slanting towards election, where the law tried to entitle the mother to do whatever she wanted with the life of her son. And this has been the justification of certain groups of people who considered that abortion had to be depenalized in legislations to the extent that it would become a right, and it is only limited, and this is a philosophy of the more advanced legislations like the Spanish one, which is limited for reasons of health on the part of the mother if the pregnancy is very complicated. So we're going to limit it and set some specific term, and then something which is different to the US, that the gynecologist, the European gynecologists themselves consider there might be a feasibility, and they only allow the exception of a malformation, which is something that we could also discuss, because at the end of the day the system is mixed. There is a part which is election, but even in the Spanish legislation, which is one of the more aggressive, there is a depenalizing question. So I think it is important that in the origin this is reverted. So I mean that this is not a right on the part of the woman due to her freedom. So on the one hand, we're seeing to what extent certain exceptions can evade such a clear precept of that of killing an innocent being, and it also presents the post-ruling. How are we going to act? What are the measures that we can put forth? Okay, symbiosis of a mother and a child, but there are women who reject this, so we must make sure that society can also help, that there is support, because otherwise we're going to run the risk, and this has been the reason of many abortions in Europe, that many abortions are done in a clandestine way, and this could entail also many women dying in the process. So this was something that has to be taken into consideration in the pro-life, because it is not a matter of criminalizing. It is more important to support, especially in something so beautiful as a pregnancy, when there is an involvement of one being with another being. Something difficult for us men to understand it in full, this very integral symbiosis. How can we do it without being aggressive, but rather supporting, advising? And I think the experience of all the pro-life movements has been that many of women, but anyway, in this life you can never say things 100%, but sometimes or many times when women are supported and they realize they're not alone, then they change their opinion because they acknowledge what they have inside the uterus, and biology plays an important part, and it becomes very intuitive for them with regards to the innocent.
Gracias. Antes de dar paso al auditorio y a sus preguntas, que seguro que tendrán muchas, una última cuestión que me gustaría lanzar.
Before we give the floor to the audience, because I'm sure that they're going to have a lot of questions, I'd like to say something that maybe sounds obvious. Talking about the nature of human embryo and all of these technologies that are coming up in the last few years that turn around the question of whether it is or not moral to use human embryos in experiments and therefore the distraction afterwards and so on. It seems that it is quite obvious that we cannot answer to what or who the human embryo is only from an individual science such as biology, medicine, or even philosophy. So I'd like to ask our guest speakers how they believe that we can satisfactorily integrate these different disciplines that I just mentioned by respecting the epistemological statute of each one of them. Allow me to please start by inviting Professor Snead to start, and then we'll give the floor to the rest of the guest speakers. So, first of all, clip number 7 so that we can listen to the video of Professor Snead.
So my area of research and teaching is public bioethics, which is inherently, sort of intrinsically interdisciplinary. Now, I'm a legal scholar. My area of expertise is the law. But when you venture into these interdisciplinary questions, as you say, you have to leave your comfort zone. You have to study and understand questions relating to science, questions relating to philosophy, in some cases theology, in some cases social science. And I think that, first of all, it's very exciting as a scholar to be encountering and engaging with these other disciplines. It's exciting because you learn so many new interesting things. It's exciting because you get to collaborate with colleagues from other fields, and you bridge the disciplinary gaps through your relationship and through your study together and through learning with one another. But it really does require a kind of, and it, as you say, it does give you some trepidation because you are outside of your comfort zone. And in order to, and the way that we should respond to that is through humility, understanding that because I'm an expert in one thing doesn't mean I'm an expert in other things. I have to rely on the expertise of others, which involves collaboration and encounter, and you have to be humble. You have to be humble, and you have to be ready to work very, very hard to learn areas that are not necessarily your own particular areas of expertise. So yes, it makes you nervous, but it's also very exciting. And the truth is, I think it's the only way to really get a full vision of all of human reality, which is to say, to understand other disciplines, to be in conversation with other disciplines, to augment your own understanding and hopefully to augment the understanding of others. And again, this is the spirit, I think, of the Expanded Reasons project, and why I'm so grateful that my book was recognized by the Institute.
Gracias, Professor Snead. Professora Condic?
Well, I think this is really the key question, the question we have been addressing for the last 2 days. Last night I spoke at some length about the process that my brother Samuel and I went through in the writing of our book, how challenging it was, but it is really critical in order to achieve integration across biological, medical, and philosophical disciplines, in order to discuss these medical and philosophical issues that exist at the frontiers of science. So respect for the epistemological perspective of each discipline is inherent in the development of a common language. We have to start with respect, and that requires listening, often listening over long periods of time and with great frustration, because what you will hear won't make a lot of sense to you. Unless all parties can recognize that they need each other. If we come at this from the position of an expert, we're not listening. We have to come at it, as Carter just said, from a position of humility, from a willingness to acknowledge the need we have for people in other disciplines. And this also requires mutual respect. We have to value what other people can tell us. But in the absence of a sincere desire to understand reality, no integration is possible. And the only thing left to us is utility. Utility will determine which party dominates the discussion. And we have seen this play out recently across the entire globe in the context of COVID-19. So in the United States, we have been repeatedly reminded that we need to, quote, follow the science for matters of medicine, for matters of public policy, for matters of sociology, for matters of education, for all sorts of diverse matters that were impacted by this virus. And even our judgment about what was correct, whether we were right or wrong in thinking that we should have a vaccination, for example, had to be determined by the science, Why did science assume such a predominant position in this very complex, three-dimensional, and very emotionally challenging situation for so many people? I would argue it's because science has given us very useful tools for combating a novel virus. Because of utility. The individual in the discussion with the greatest utility dominates. And yet, I would also argue that this kind of a process, allowing the person with the greatest power to dominate, is the exact opposite of open or expanded reasoning. For an integrated understanding to exist, cross-communication must be ongoing, and it needs to anticipate the future directions of science and medicine. Once a novel virus arises, there's no time to develop a meaningful dialogue about what to do, what is the most appropriate thing to do, unless we have developed a common language and mutual respect early on. So this needs to be an ongoing process. Otherwise, we accept a terrible price. In the case of a medical crisis like COVID-19, a terrible price of human suffering and human death. Or we bow to science without any three-dimensional consideration of all the other issues that COVID-19 created for society.
Professor Pastor.
Professor Pastor? The first thing that comes to my mind, and I just wrote it down, is that listening and making the effort to know well the other discipline. And I'm saying this because sometimes we scientists, hard scientists, those of hard science, eventually end up liking philosophy. I actually have always loved philosophy. I actually studied philosophy apart from being a science. But most of the times I see that the legal world, the philosophical world, tend to be reluctant to wanting to know more in details reality. And that is an issue that I'm posing because it's probably our fault that we do not want to know the languages or the discourse or looking a way of expressing things that we find in reality and taking it to the philosophers and the other way around. And that is a very interesting topic, but we cannot go into the details of the two cultures of snow that they were discussing in the 70s. In any way, I need to acknowledge that we need to talk, we need to try to know the two languages, yes. We need to go in depth, but we also need to know which are the limits of each plane and what are the planes. And there's issues that science is not going to solve, and those issues and decisions are maybe prudential, purely political, or some of them are only ethical, and with science we can only get to a certain limit. And if you acknowledge the nature of each discipline, and if you acknowledge the cognitive limit, the formal or material object, as you want to call it, we need to realize that all of that is manifestations of the human reason, the instrumental, empiric, scientific reason, aesthetic, ethic reason. When I hear a lot the talk about anthropology, I love it, but the practical reason that each one of us have acts without big discourses, anthropological discourse, because we get with quite certainty about what is good and what is bad, even if we turn it around and we look for the anthropological foundation. But after all, what I mean is that those are different levels, planes, and it's difficult sometimes for us to have the same thing at the same time. And sometimes, therefore, we have perspectives of different types. And sometimes, maybe, we are not able to join them in the same action and see the interrelationship we have amongst them. My position, therefore, is that only God has that ability, reason that is public, and unique within its identity, and we see that reasons are like divided. So I'm thinking about an issue, which is that the reason that we have with those dimensions is related and linked to our person, but we need to have distinction, not confusion. And we cannot be argumenting or wanting to fundament certain things from science when it is not the sphere nor the conclusion. We're confusing different planes or levels. Allow me to say that we're doing a bad apologetics that is easily arguable, and that's bad science, a bad philosophy in that sense. I believe that we have to acknowledge that mental limit that we have and not try to deduce certain things from where we cannot deduce them. It's evident that scientific evidence is a necessary but not sufficient condition. Then we have the interpretations. Facts are facts, but you need to interpret them. We need to have a meta-science. Science itself uses philosophical concepts when it's built. When we biologists build, we talk about substance or a function or other concepts that are metaphysical, after all. But then we do a meta-biological reflection, and then finally we have the philosophical one. So there's an issue here which I find is a necessary but not sufficient condition. And I believe that in the case of bioethics, it is not possible to have an experimental bioethics, as some authors have said. And I worry about that because some people, and I wrote down 4 types of scientificism, 2 types of scientificism, scientificism which is social, a scientificism which is hard, and social skepticism and a hard skepticism. That is to say, right now we're saying that sometimes we want the same evidence, and we want to be scientists when you cannot be a scientist, and we shouldn't be a scientist. We want certain issues to say, well, science says that. Well, not really. Science, in front of a series of data, such as the case that we mentioned earlier, I agree that it is an individual of the human species. It's a human being, but the discussion about whether it is a person or not at another level. Now, it does have human nature. We totally agree. That is biology, and biology gets there, but not beyond that. On the one hand, we have a social scientificism in the sense that everybody believes that science is the only truth, the only type of truth. But then we have, and that would be the hard scientificism, but then we have social scientificism, where people think and say, well, what science doesn't say, it's not true. It's not true if science doesn't say it. But at the same time, there's an important social skepticism that has been generated because we're all aware of the fact that many issues of science are not solved by science. Actually, the skepticism exists even at a social level widely, but it also starts happening with scientists. We realize the limit and the possibilities of our own knowledge, but it is true that sometimes we see that in scientific spheres, people tend to think the only possible knowledge is the experimental one. That's what I attain to, while society we realize that people know that science has not a solution for all the issues at all. In any case, that poses a problem of epistemology in the sense that we need to know what it is that science says. We need to know that scientific truths are partial. They're always subject to a context. Actually, that context has allowed us to be able to obtain those partial truths, and that little maybe truth has a certain degree of subjective certainty, but it doesn't have a lot of repercussion, while instead the more philosophical issues are truths which are much more juicy in the sense that they have more width Very often they're part of our reason and our reasoning, so we need not deny them, but they do not have the physical evidence that we may have, while they have the specificity that they're more universalizable, and they are not useful to live and function life. So it's good to combine both of them in the person, but it is not possible for us to confuse them either. It is difficult to get to that confusion. What happens is that we sometimes confuse them mentally amongst them, between them, and we should differentiate them ourselves in our own reasoning. Thank you to our speakers. I don't know how many more minutes we have for questions from the panel, from the floor, I mean. A classical adagio that we all know, St. Thomas talked about philosophy that was talking about the truth of theology. We could say that theology is not the in Chile of the experimental sciences, but it is true that the world, the cosmos, science gives us many data, and I believe that philosophers should realize which they are and try to integrate them with the tradition and with thinking and with... Any questions from the floor?
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a los ponentes por las intervenciones.
I'd like to thank the speakers for the very clear presentations they have had, considering the questions that were quite challenging, actually. One of them comes to my mind, which is the big complexity of gene therapy. Many variables that we cannot control, and most probably we will never control. The huge possibility of having many collateral effects that we don't even suspect, but also our bigger and bigger intolerance to uncertainty. I see all of this is a huge pressure to force human experimentation, and that makes me be very scared. I really feel vertigo and fear. Do the speakers share this fear with me?
I do and I do not. I think popular culture has made it so common in movies and in books to think about creating transhuman identities, to make humans better than humans, to substantially alter their nature. And I believe that romantic idea seems very compelling to us, first because it's exciting and opens up a great world of new possibilities for humans. But I think it is also justified in our minds by our often very weak understanding of evolution. We say this is just a faster way of doing what nature itself does, so how can it be wrong? And yet, I do believe that people do not think about the callousness and cruelty of nature. Nature has no problem killing individuals, killing entire species, killing huge populations, creating dwarfed and ill individuals. It's all part of the experiment. And I think there is something very different about nature introducing a mutation that creates disability or death, and us doing the same thing to other humans. So on the one hand, I think we have exaggerated and romanticized the notion of using genetic engineering to change the species and to improve it. But I also think that scientists who are much closer to the processes of evolution and have much more practical experience are more alarmed. The first people that raised the alarm about the use of CRISPR in embryos were scientists. And it was an immediate and very, very serious alarm. That is, of course, not enough to prevent it from happening, but it does it does offer perspective that, yes, scientists are alarmed by this as well, because we know enough to know how very dangerous and radical this approach can be.
I would say something. The most balanced position is not the post-modernity one, which has a vision that says, well, let's leave aside the big discourses. Science has done huge things. They have lost innocence after the Second World War and many things. And on the other hand, modernity, talking about science of progress, ongoing progress, effective progress, that knows everything, that gets everything, transforms everything. The balanced position, I believe, is a position that should have humbleness, but also we should realize how beautiful the ability we have in our hands is to transform the world and transform it for good. The human being is infinitely much more than what she is, as Pascal would say. It's not, as Nietzsche says, that he says it's just a means to become a superhuman. Man has a big capacity in his or her own dignity and nature. What I'm worried about, well, maybe it's not that I'm worried. I agree with the fact that we scientists worry about the consequences, but making an ethical discourse only with consequences, it's not sufficient. We need to go more in depth in our own nature, in what we are, in what really we have in the bottom of our being. And that's what I worry about. That with transhumanism, for instance, we try to improve the qualities or whatever, let's do whatever. And you may say, well, what I want to be is that what I am now, but in fullness, what my heart, what my person desires is, as you all know, is happiness. And obviously immortality, but not in these conditions, nor in this situation. And I believe that we need to preserve our own nature, our own dignity, and that is what we need to have. Obviously, the consequences are important in the ethical act and the evaluation of that act, but it's only a part. It's not just that.
¿Alguna pregunta? Sí, ahí hay otra pregunta.
Any more questions? Yes, there's one over there.
No se oye.
We cannot hear the question. Okay, now. Thank you. I have learned a lot. I am very thankful to all of you for the opportunity. I would like to insist on the topic of complexity, but above all, the second part of the expression biotechnology, that is to say, from technology. Maybe it is that I don't know how to read it properly, but I'm under the feeling that we're being reduced to genes, and genes have, from the technological point of view, many advantages. Certainly, they are a permanent characteristic. They allow us to make predictions. They relate to our identity, but above all, there's a finite number of genes, and also, if I know them, I may use those data to extrapolate future conclusions and apply, for instance, all of the new AI systems. But I feel really vertigo when I think that I may be reduced to genes, because I don't understand very clearly what's the correlation between health and genes. I understand that reducing us to genes means trying to reduce the complexity. Everybody has to do that in order to be able to implement models. But to me, genetic reductionism is something that I'm more and more afraid every day. And since I don't come from science, that is probably the social skepticism that somebody was talking about earlier. In between science and philosophy, there is a way of seeing evidences from the mathematical point of view that is applied to technology and that will then be applied to AI. And I don't clearly see which are the correlations. So my question is, are you really worried also? Or is it just because I'm ignorant about this? Are you worried about this genetic reductionism that has led us to think that the gene therapy was going to just cut a little piece of our DNA and was going to solve our health?
I think, like all complicated topics, there are many interpretations. I think genetic reductionism is not as common in the scientific community as it might seem from the outside. I think most scientists fully understand that genes are part of a fully integrated organism. And in part, this is because we have learned over the years that genes have complicated effects. They have different effects at different ages. They have different effects against different genetic backgrounds. A gene in a woman will have a different effect than a gene in a man, and a gene in a girl will have a different effect than in a woman. So we've learned to see genes as parts, not to see people as a collection of genes. However, I do worry about hubris. I worry about arrogance, that it's very easy for scientists to step beyond the understanding we have and believe that they can improve a situation by changing a part without truly understanding how that part integrates into the whole. There are some situations that are very simple. We know what hemoglobin does. We know the genetic mutation in that gene that causes sickle cell anemia. We know sickle cell anemia is a disastrous disease for the people who have it. We know that we could return the damaged form of hemoglobin gene to a natural form. And we could do that using genetic engineering. And if we do that, we would be pretty confident because the gene for hemoglobin has been tested not just over hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, but in many other mammalian species, we're pretty confident that we know what the natural form of hemoglobin does. So there's some kinds of genetic reductionism, reducing sickle cell anemia to a mutation in hemoglobin, that are very reasonable and very clearly medicine. If we can do this manipulation with confidence that we are not going to introduce any negative effects because of the procedure, I would have no ethical concerns. Where I start worrying, and as you say, feeling nauseous, feeling vertigo about this idea, is when we start jumping from things we don't understand very well to manipulations of humans. And I'll just give a single example. There was great excitement about 15 years ago when scientists discovered that in mice, if you remove the function of a gene known as myostatin, so this is a gene that functions during embryonic life to limit the growth of muscle. So myo is for muscle, and statin is to stop. So if you remove this gene, you get mice that they called, mighty mouse, the very, very muscular mice that have almost no fat, and they live longer, and they're much stronger. And from the first impression, you would think, could possibly be wrong with this? It's a wonderful thing. We should do this to everybody. Make us all very strong, very muscular, and no fat. Well, it was only after time that we discovered that myostatin does more than stop the growth of muscle. And as it turned out, there are many naturally occurring mutations in this gene, in cattle and in dogs, and those animals are very, very ill. They have skeletal malformations, they have problems with their kidneys, they have problems with their brains, they have problems with many other things, besides being very muscular and having no fat. So this is what causes me to worry, is that people will begin to do what Dr. He did to those 2 little girls, reduce their lifespan by 21% on average, because he thought he was helping them.
Comparto con la doctora que la
I share with the doctor that geneticization of health, that reductionism, we see it more and more as something that, scientifically speaking, does not exist except for some specific cases of conditions or diseases that are monogenetic. And there's another important aspect, the environment, something that we know is and which interacts with the genome. And this reminded me of a discussion that lasted for years regarding the embryo, where some wanted to reduce the human corporality to the genome, strictly speaking, and on the other side you found those that thought the environment were making the embryo program. So neither were right, because in reality it is a living being and it is interacting, and the gene is a part of that unit, as Dr. said, which is the organism, which is present from the very beginning. So I believe it is important, because otherwise we would be always, even if we wouldn't like, we would be just going around, is it a genome? Yes, no, or because I think both ideas are interlinked, intertwined, and everything participates and everything interacts, and this is very important. I believe biology here gives an information that we can elaborate later on a philosophical realm, to realize that for the human being, one of the main characteristics is the relation, which is from the very beginning of the human being in its development. Well, thank you very much for the questions from the public, and we're going to close now this roundtable, thanking once again our speakers, Professor Snead, Professor Condic, Professor Pastor, all of you for attending. And as we said at the beginning, we're going to have a 5-minute break to organize the award session.